Hey, how's it going? In my previous video, I walked you through how to set up Storybook 7 from scratch on a Vite React.js application. This video is kind of the follow-up to that. I mentioned that I was going to talk about interaction tests, which is one of the newer features that came out with Storybook 7. Now I'm going to show you how to set up interaction tests for an existing installation of Storybook in just a second, but first we need to talk about for me to show you how to test things in Storybook, we probably should have something to test. Now, what I was thinking of doing is from Radix UI, this is like a unstyled component library. We can maybe bring in this form example that they have here, which you can just go to Radix UI and copy this code if you like, if you're following along. But what they have here is a very simple form that has a little bit of validation. So for example, if I try to submit early without entering anything, it'll say, hey, please enter these things. If I enter an invalid email, it's going to tell me that, hey, please provide a valid email. And finally, if I, enter valid stuff, the error message just disappears. And if I submit, it moves forward. So you can kind of see as I talk through that, there's a couple of things there that we could test, right? Our interaction test could do something similar to what I just did, where we type in invalid input and assert that there's an error message. We can input valid input and assert that there's no error message. And also possibly assert that, once we input both valid things and hit that submit, we can, something happens, some kind of event maybe gets called. All right, so what I have on the left here is a React.js application made with Vite, and also it already has Storybook set up, and this is exactly the same code that I had in my previous video. So if you want to see how this was made from scratch, make sure to watch that first. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and try to bring in this exact form example into our application and create some stories for it. So if we take a look here, it says that we need to install Radix UI/React form. I'll go ahead and copy that, paste that into my terminal. And while that's running, I'm also going to create a new component. Let's just call this form.tsx. Next, I'm just going to copy this form example, paste that into our form.tsx. We're probably also going to need this styles CSS file. So we're going to go ahead and create styles.css. And we'll also copy that from the source code here. Next, we're going to go ahead and create the stories file for this form component. So remember, we're going to import meta and story object from Storybook just for the types. And then we'll import our form itself. Next, we're going to define the meta for the set of stories that we're going to have in here. At a minimum, we're just going to specify what component we're using and also the title of our story page. Make sure to export default that meta, and we're going to create the type for each story. And then finally, we're going to create a new base story for our form. We have enough here to actually run Storybook and display the form in the browser, so I'm going to put up the terminal. And by the way, one quick note, because of the import styles here from Radix UI/colors on styles.css, you also will want to npm install at Radix UI/colors. Anyways, at this point, let's go ahead and run Storybook. Alright, so you can see on the right side that Storybook is running and we can see our form. The only catch is we can't see the labels because in the original CSS, those are all white. We could change the CSS, but I'm actually just going to change the background here so we can see it. And if we play around with this, we should see that it behaves exactly the same as our demo. Alright, so we have our base component. Let's go ahead and set up our Storybook to be able to do interaction testing. In the terminal, we're going to go ahead and install Storybook/testing library, Storybook/jest, Storybook/add-on interactions. After that, we do need to configure our Storybook config to actually enable that add-on. So we're going to go into .storybook directory, main.ts. And remember, there's an array here where you can add add-ons. Now, you may or may not already actually have the add-on for interactions in here. If you don't have it, make sure to add it in there. Now, going back to our form.storage.tsx, we're going to add a couple more imports in here. One, we're going to import within and user event from Storybook/testing library. Those are the things that's going to allow us to interact with our component. And then we're also going to import expect from Storybook/jest. That's going to be used for assertions. It's exactly what you expect. It's going to have pretty much the same exact API as your typical jest. Alright, so here's how we set up our interaction tests. Within a story, you can add a play function, which is an async function that takes in a canvas element. We then will take our canvas element and pass it to our within function. This will give us sort of a reference to our canvas, which we can then use that canvas to query things on our rendered component. So perhaps, for example, we want to query our submit button. We can do something like canvas.getByText, post a question. So that allows us to query the button. We can then assert that that button actually is in the document. So we can use that expect function that we imported, pass in our submit button in here, and do to be in the document. So that's a very basic test that we have. It's not even really an interaction. We're just querying something and asserting that it's there. Now, assuming that Storybook is running, you should notice that there is a interactions tab here on the bottom panel. And right now there's actually a red box there, which tells us that our test is failing. And why is that? And if we look into it, it says that we couldn't find anything on the DOM that says post a question, which is correct. This is actually should be post question. I made a mistake there. So let's go ahead and delete the A here. And you can see that the test automatically reruns, and now it's passing because it's able to find this element. Now it's quickly worth mentioning that in order to be able to be effective at running these tests, ideally you already know the API for testing library as well as jest, because you need the first one to query things on the screen, and then you need the jest API to make assertions off of that. Now I can't go over the full API of both of these things, but the code that I'll write in this video should be fairly intuitive. For React testing library, I highly recommend taking a look at the different ways that you can query things. For example, there's actually a guiding principle here of, the gist of it is that make sure that your code or your UI is accessible. So it actually promotes that you first query by role, and then there's other ones here like query by labeled text that we're going to use later. And then if you can't use any of those, get by text. Right, so get by text is sort of like the universal find me something on the screen that has this text. But if you can use something that further promotes accessibility, they suggest that you use that. So for example, we could refactor this to be get by role, and we need to provide the role here to be button, and we need to update this to instead look for a button with the name of this text. And if we quickly go back to Storybook, you should see that our test is still passing. Right, so you should also know that you can query substrings. So for example, if I just wanted to query post, this should still pass. And also if you want to make it be case insensitive, let's do post, and then so this is a regex, so we can do I here to make it not care about the casing. So now this is looking for a button that mentions post regardless of casing, and it's still passing, right? So doing it this way makes your code a little bit less brittle to refactors. Like for example, maybe one day you were just refactoring this to capital case, right? Post question, right? Our test will still pass. It's not brittle because it doesn't care about the casing of that text. Anyways, moving forward with the jest API, there's really not much you need to know about here. The big one is to be in the document. And you can also flip things like to not be in the document, right? So there's a bunch of things you can use in there. I'll show a couple examples as I go through this video, but let's go ahead and, write better tests here. We don't want to just assert that there is a button. We want to, like we said earlier, we want to make sure that users can actually type into our form and see errors if they put in bad input. All right, so to make our test a little bit better here, we can also query our email and question input boxes. And notice that as I type, it does give you a pretty good intelligence of all the things you can do. Like I mentioned earlier, generally you want to do things by role. For input boxes, you actually want to use get by label text, right? Because the idea is, visually a user will look for the label and associate an input, right? Like if you were looking at this, you're going to look for the thing that says email and associate this box with that label, right? So instead of trying to query the box directly, you actually want to query sort of the input box that's associated with something that says email. So we're going to do canvas dot get by, you don't need it all here, get by label text email, and we'll do the same thing for question. And let's go ahead and just make the same assertions that, hey, these things are on the screen, the user can find them. right? And you should see that now in our visual interactions tab here, it shows those 3 assertions and everything's good, everything is passing. Now personally, I like to have a base test like this where it just asserts that all the things I expect on to be on the screen are actually on the screen and are visible. And from here we can build upon this and actually create real interactions. So for example, let's make a new story where we will simulate a form submit. So let's do a story for empty submit. Now for this one, all we mostly need to do is find the submit button, actually click it, right? Remember we imported user event. Just as the name implies, it's a user event, so we can do await user event dot, and you can see all the different things that you can do, like hover, typing, tabbing, clicking, double clicking. We're gonna do click our submit button. Remember when we hit our submit button, we expect the errors to show up. Please enter an email and please enter a question. So we're gonna make those assertions. So after the submit, we expect that text to show up. So we should do await expect canvas.getByText, and let's query enter email ignore case to be in a document, and let's do the same thing for question. I think this should be enter a question. Oh, it should be enter email and enter a question, right? And we need to actually move to our empty submit story here where this specific test is running, and you'll notice that it's already at the state after the test has run, right? So you can see that there's actually a stepper here. You can step through your assertions. So if we start all the way at the beginning, it's as if we just rendered this form, nothing has happened, and then we move forward to where the user clicks the button, and then it runs our assertions of this thing is on the screen, this thing is on the screen, and everything passes because it's doing exactly what expected to do. Upon submit, we're going to show the user some errors. All right, hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and move on to our next test case, which is we want to make sure that the error message here differs when a user does input something but is perhaps an invalid email. And we're going to do the same exact thing. We're going to create a new story. We're just going to copy this because a lot of this is the same logic that we want. We're going to rename this to invalid email, and we still need the canvas and the submit button. We do still need to submit, but there's a little bit of addition here where we need to type an invalid email. So we're gonna do await user event that type, and actually we need to bring in our email query, our email input query. Let's paste that in here. So we're gonna go ahead and type in our email something invalid. Okay, and our assertions, this is still a valid assertion because we didn't enter a question, but now I believe this should be valid email. Like it'll say please enter a valid email. So let's take a look at our new story, invalid email, and our test is failing here because we should have submitted after typing. That's a new mistake there. You can see that again. You can rerun this, you can step through it if you'd like. Notice that we start from empty form, the user types in there, and then we hit submit, and then the things pop up, and then each of our assertions starts getting checked. And you can start to see how each story that we have is starting to document the different variants of our form here, which to me is one of the bigger, aside from testing, one of the best benefits of Storybook is documentation. It gives you a visual catalog of all the different states that your components can be in, right? So we have an empty state, right? So we've got an empty state. Maybe we actually should rename base to just be empty, but anyways, we've got empty submit, invalid email, and then what's next? Probably actually providing valid stuff, right? So let's go ahead and make another copy here because a lot of the things here are reusable. So let's do valid inputs, and we're gonna need to bring in our query for the question. And this is why I like to have a base like this of all the things on all the elements, because I'm likely to copy them over to the different tests that I have. So we're going to bring back question here, and we're going to provide a valid email input. We're also going to provide a question input. Make sure this is question, right? And hit submit. Now at the assertion level, instead of us saying that, hey, there should be errors, we should be doing the inverse, saying, hey, there shouldn't be errors, right? It's also good to check the inverse of things. So we're going to do expect canvas dot query by. Remember, you want to use query for things that are potentially not on the screen. Otherwise, if you use get, it's going to fail. It's going to throw an error. So we're going to do query by text. And we're going to say that this should be not on a document. And to be complete, we might even want to bring back the other assertion that we have from the original one, like this one. That should be query by text. Should not be on the document. And before we test this on Storybook itself, I think we do need to add a little bit of logic here, because what's going to happen is, when they click the submit, it's going to trigger a browser refresh, right? If we don't prevent that behavior. All right, so here's what we're going to do in our form.tsx. We're going to add an onSubmit here to prevent the default so it doesn't refresh the page. And then perhaps we can display something on the screen, just saying that, hey, thanks for your submission, or something like that. So let's use a little bit of state. Perhaps we just have a boolean here that acts as a flag to show a message or not. And we're going to do that upon successful submission. So we're going to do if show message. We're just going to render right. And then in our onSubmit here, let's go ahead and toggle set show message to true. Now with that little bit of refactoring, we should probably also assert that eventually we see this on the screen in our test. So going back to our form.stories.tsx, we've entered valid inputs for both of our input boxes. We hit submit. We are asserting that we're not seeing any error messages, and then we should also ultimately assert that expect canvas.get by text, that this shows up in the document, right? And let's make this be a color white just to be consistent, right? And we can see in our valid input story, all we see is the successful submission because it ran through our test already. But again, if we were to step through from the start, we have a base form. If we were to step through, we can do go forward. We enter a valid email, then it enters a valid question, then it hits submit, and then it starts asserting that all these things are not on the screen, and then that at the end of it, our success message is on the screen. Right, so now again, we've got a bunch of tests, and all of our different states of our form is documented and tested. Right, so hopefully you're starting to see why interaction testing is really useful. They really are almost equivalent to unit testing, except they're running on the browser, on a real browser, meaning you don't have to worry about, missing browser APIs on JS DOM, for example, if you were just running this on the terminal on just straight up Jest. It's worth noting that notice that our tests technically only run at the point where you visit that story, right? So you can kind of imagine that as your catalog grows, it would be kind of painful to step through each of our individual stories to make sure that our tests are passing. There is a solution to that. You can see in the documentation it says that you can use this test runner. And let me see if I can show you how to set this up real quick. We just need to install Storybook/test runner. So let's go ahead and install that real quick in our terminal, Storybook/test runner. And it says that we need to add a npm script for that. Let's copy this, and I'll just add it at the top here. Do notice that the runner assumes that Storybook is running, and specifically on port 6006. So if you're running it on a different port, make sure to provide the URL here. and also make sure that your Storybook actually is running. Right, so mine still is running, so I'm going to go ahead and do npm run test Storybook. And there you go, you see that we got test passing, and it's actually running also on the previous story that I wrote in the previous video. You can even add the verbose flag if you want, and that'll show you the individual tests that you have, right, for our stories. So that's typically how you would probably automate running your tests, right? Like you wouldn't expect yourself to click through these each time. And to take things even a step further, you probably don't see yourself, constantly having to manually start Storybook and run the tests, right? So you could fully automate this by, for example, if you're using GitHub, GitHub Actions is one of the tools you can use to automate, your development pipeline. And I'm not going to cover this, but know that it is documented in Storybook. You can see that they have docs for setup CI to run tests. And there's two ways to do it. If you were to deploy your Storybook to, something like Vercel or Netlify, they have an example here where, you provide a target to that URL, and then it ultimately will run test Storybook off of that. Or if you don't have it deployed anywhere, they also have an example here where basically what it's going to do is, install and build your Storybook and then run the tests off of that. Right, so with these two ideas in mind, basically you should be able to completely automate the testing without you having to manually run the commands. Anyways, I'm curious what you think of this video or Storybook or interaction tests in general. Let me know in the comments any thoughts you might have or any feedback you might have. Anyways, that's it for me today, and hopefully I'll see you on the next video.